In a high school German class, a professor's dismissive laugh at a quiet black student's attempt to speak the language sets the stage for a dramatic reversal. The student, Marcus, unexpectedly unleashes a stream of flawless, native-level German, stunning his professor and classmates. This single, revelatory moment shatters the rigid classroom dynamic and forces a seasoned teacher to question everything he thought he knew about language and learning. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. Herr Schmidt was a man perpetually encased in a suit of intellectual armor, a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches that smelled faintly of old books and stale chalk. He had been teaching German at Northwood High for so long that his own students' parents remembered him standing in the same spot, gesturing with the same weathered copy of Goethe's Faust. His hair, once the color of a new textbook cover, had faded to a shade of muted gray that matched the tired-looking blackboard behind him. His classroom was a sanctuary of tradition, a place where the rules of grammar were as immutable as the laws of physics. To Herr Schmidt, language was not an art form, it was a science. It was built on the precision of declensions, the logic of case endings, and the unwavering order of sentence structure. He believed that mastery came from rigorous repetition, from the tireless drilling of verbs until they became second nature. He had a particular disdain for what he called the American disease, a casual disregard for linguistic discipline that resulted in slurred vowels and a lack of respect for syntax. His students, for the most part, simply accepted this. They scribbled notes, dutifully conjugated verbs on the board, and prayed they wouldn't be called upon to stumble through a reading of Rilke. In the back row, tucked away in the corner farthest from Herr Schmidt's piercing gaze, sat Marcus. He was a portrait of quiet intensity. His backpack was always unzipped just enough to reveal a sketchbook, its pages filled with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. His movements were deliberate and slow, as if he were constantly observing the world in a different frame rate than everyone else. He was a fixture in the class, yet he remained an enigma. He rarely spoke, never volunteered, and his answers to direct questions were concise to the point of being monosyllabic. To Herr Schmidt and the other students, he was simply the quiet kid, a ghost in the machine of the German language classroom. The other students were a motley crew, a microcosm of the school's social strata. There was Chad, the star quarterback, who saw German as a necessary evil to graduate and spent most of the class doodling football plays in his notebook. He was loud and boisterous, a stark contrast to Marcus's stillness. Chad often made a show of his struggles with German, groaning dramatically when he mixed up der, die, and das. Then there was Maria, the valedictorian candidate, who sat in the front row and absorbed every word Herr Schmidt uttered, her pen scratching furiously across the page. She was the one who kept the class on track, her hand a blur in the air, always ready with the correct answer. The unspoken agreement was that Maria would handle the intellectual heavy lifting, Chad would provide the comic relief, and everyone else would simply fade into the background. Marcus, however, was in a category all his own. He didn't engage with the class dynamic. He would sit for long stretches, his gaze fixed on Herr Schmidt's mouth as he spoke, watching the subtle shifts of his lips as he formed the intricate German vowels. Sometimes, he would close his eyes and simply listen, as if the sound waves themselves were a form of language he was deciphering. No one noticed. They were all too focused on their own struggles with the language, too consumed by the fear of being corrected by Herr Schmidt. They assumed Marcus was bored, checked out, counting down the minutes until the bell. What they didn't know was that Marcus's quietness was not a sign of disinterest, but of deep immersion. His obsession with German had started 2 years ago, when he had found a box of old vinyl records at a local thrift store. Among them was an album of classical music, a live recording from the Berlin Philharmonic, with a commentary track in German. He'd brought the record home and for some reason the language had captivated him. It sounded like a symphony in itself, all hard consonants and rolling Rs, a stark, beautiful contrast to the easy flowing rhythm of his own neighborhood's patois. He had started small, using a dictionary to translate the liner notes, and then moving on to old books and films he found at the library. The internet became his greatest teacher. He spent hours on German forums and chat rooms, reading and absorbing, his fingers flying across the keyboard, typing out thoughts he would never dare to speak aloud. He had no one to practice with and he preferred it that way. In his mind, language was a personal journey, a secret garden he tended to alone. The high school German class was just a way to add a formal structure to his self-study, to see if he was on the right track. He learned more in a single night online than he did in a week of Herr Schmidt's drills, but he kept his secret close. He had no desire to show off, no need to prove himself. He was simply there to learn. Today, however, the classroom felt different. A palpable tension hung in the air, a sense of foreboding that Marcus could feel in his bones. Herr Schmidt was conducting a reading exercise, calling on students one by one to read a passage from a short story by Heinrich Böll. The usual ritual of stuttering and correction was underway. Chad predictably mangled his lines, turning die Stadt into die Stadt, and earning a sharp, disapproving glare from Herr Schmidt. Maria equally predictably delivered her lines with impeccable diction, earning a terse nod of approval. The spotlight moved across the room, a slow, methodical march toward the back row. Marcus felt his heart begin to pound. He knew the passage by heart. He could recite it in his sleep. He knew every verb conjugation, every noun case, every nuance of tone and meaning. But the thought of speaking it aloud in front of everyone, of shattering the quiet, safe wall he had built around himself, was terrifying. He lowered his head, hoping to become invisible. It was no use. The march stopped. The silence in the room became absolute. "Marcus," Herr Schmidt said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Your turn. Please read the next passage, starting on page 42, the third paragraph." The command was a full stop, a moment of reckoning. All eyes turned to him. Maria watched with a flicker of polite curiosity. Chad looked like he was about to burst out laughing. Marcus slowly lifted his head, a single line of sweat tracing its way down his temple. He knew what they expected. A stumble. A hesitant, broken attempt. He had given them no reason to expect anything else. And for a moment, the weight of their expectations, the quiet disdain of Herr Schmidt, and the mockery in Chad's eyes seemed to press down on him. He opened his textbook, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked at the first sentence and then he closed the book again. He raised his eyes to meet Herr Schmidt's. The professor's lips curled into a faint, impatient smile. A sound, half snort, half chuckle, escaped his lips. The mockery was not loud or overt, but it was there, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound that said everything he felt about the boy in the back row. A sound that said, "You can't possibly do this." The entire class waited. Then Marcus began to speak. The faint, amused chuckle that had escaped Herr Schmidt's lips froze mid-air, a brittle, forgotten sound. The room, which had been holding its breath in anticipation of Marcus's inevitable stumble, was now witness to something utterly unexpected. Marcus didn't clear his throat or stutter. He didn't hesitate or search for the right words. His voice, which had previously only existed as a low murmur, rose into the stillness, clear and resonant, and it was perfect. He began the passage, and with each word the air shifted. It was not the halting, clipped German of a high school student. It was the German of Berlin, of a native speaker. The R's were a soft, guttural hum. The vowels were pronounced with a purity and depth that Herr Schmidt himself struggled to produce at times. His cadence was flawless, a rhythmic, musical flow that gave life to the simple prose of Heinrich Böll. He didn't just read the words, he embodied them. The narrative of the short story, a somber tale of post-war life, took on a new, poignant weight. Marcus's voice carried the exhaustion of the characters, the subtle desperation in their conversations, the bitter taste of their memories. He moved through the complex syntax with the effortless grace of a dancer, making every tricky subjunctive and multi-part verb seem simple, as if it were the only way the sentence could possibly be formed. Chad's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered awe. His mouth hung slightly open, as if he were trying to catch the words as they flew past him. He had always seen German as a code to be cracked, a jumble of strange sounds and impossible rules. Marcus, however, was speaking it like a song. Maria, ever the perfectionist, sat up a little straighter. Her expression was a mix of intense fascination and a dawning, uncomfortable realization. She had believed she was the intellectual superior in the class, the one who had unlocked the secrets of the language. Now, a quiet boy from the back row was demonstrating a level of fluency she hadn't even known was possible for a high school student. Her perfect A+ in German suddenly felt less significant. As Marcus continued to speak, Herr Schmidt's face underwent a series of transformations. First, there was shock, pure, unadulterated astonishment. his eyebrows shot up, and the habitual frown lines around his mouth smoothed out. Then came disbelief. He leaned forward slightly, as if to confirm that the voice was indeed coming from Marcus and not some hidden speaker. He squinted, his eyes darting between the boy and the open textbook, trying to find a mistake, a single mispronounced word, a grammatical error that would prove this was all a fluke. He found none. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just a steady, confident stream of perfect German. The disbelief gave way to a dawning, grudging respect. It was a language teacher's dream to hear such mastery, and a nightmare to realize it had blossomed under your nose without your knowledge. Marcus finished the passage and the room was enveloped in a profound silence. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Marcus looked up, his expression calm and unreadable. He had broken the spell, and now he was back inside his quiet fortress. Herr Schmidt cleared his throat, a sharp, rasping sound that broke the tension. He closed his own textbook with a snap and looked at Marcus, his eyes now narrowed not with impatience, but with a new, professional curiosity. "Marcus," he said, his voice a little softer than usual, "tell me. You've been in my class for a year now. Why have you never spoken like this before?" He spoke the question in German, a deliberate challenge, a test of not just memory, but of true conversational ability. Marcus didn't flinch. He responded immediately, his voice still carrying the same flawless inflection. "Ich lerne es seit 2 Jahren alien. Ich war in Ihrem Unterricht, zu sehen, ob ich auf dem richtigen Weg war." The German was fluent and concise, a statement that was both deeply respectful and a quiet, dignified rebuke. The translation, which every student in the room now silently struggled to piece together, was devastating. "I have been learning it on my own for 2 years. I was in your class to see if I was on the right track. There was no need to speak before." Herr Schmidt's face went pale. He, a man who had dedicated his life to the proper teaching of German, had been serving as a benchmark for a student who was light years ahead of him. The professional pride that had been his defining trait was now thoroughly humbled. The classroom was no longer his domain, a sanctuary of his own making. It was a stage on which he had just been upstaged by a silent, unassuming boy he had completely underestimated. Maria, who had finally translated Marcus's words, felt a pang of mortification. She had always been the one to have the answers, to be in control. Now she was staring at the boy in the back row, a total stranger, a quiet genius who had been hiding in plain sight. Chad, who had been on the verge of making a sarcastic comment about Marcus's newfound voice, now simply shook his head, a genuine look of wonder on his face. He finally understood. This wasn't some trick or a fluke. This was the real deal. The bell rang, a sudden jarring sound that released them all from the frozen moment. The students began to pack their bags, but the usual chaos was replaced by a subdued, thoughtful quiet. As they shuffled out, a few of them glanced at Marcus, but he was already lost in his own world, his sketchbook open on his desk, his pencil moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The ghost was now a person with a secret. Herr Schmidt remained at his desk, staring at the empty chalkboard, his copy of Bohl's short story still open. He looked out the window at the setting sun, a new kind of silence settling in his classroom. It was the silence of a man who had just had his entire professional worldview upended. He had always believed that language was about strict adherence to rules, a series of tedious drills and rigid instruction. But the quiet boy in the back row had just shown him that language was something more. It was a secret, living thing. A hidden symphony. And he, the self-proclaimed master, had just been given a glimpse of a song far more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next day's class, and the usual shuffling of backpacks and rustling of papers was conspicuously absent. An unspoken tension hung in the air, a silence heavier and more profound than the one that had settled over the room just 24 hours earlier. The classroom, once a predictable stage for Herr Schmidt's rigid, theatrical lessons, now felt like a foreign country. All eyes, with a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity, were on Marcus, who had already settled into his usual back row corner, a silent king on a newly discovered throne. Herr Schmidt entered, and the change in him was immediate and palpable. He wasn't wearing his usual tweed jacket. Instead, he had on a simple pressed polo shirt, and his movements were less sharp, his shoulders slightly slumped. He didn't stride to the blackboard with his customary air of authority. He walked slowly, thoughtfully to the front of his desk and simply stood there for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the students. He looked at Chad, who was pretending to be engrossed in his textbook. He looked at Maria, whose pen was poised over her notebook, waiting for the first word. And he looked at Marcus. The professor's expression was unreadable. It was not a look of anger or even embarrassment, but of deep, quiet contemplation. He cleared his throat, but instead of launching into the day's grammar lesson, he spoke in English, his voice softer than they had ever heard it. "I have taught for over 30 years, he said, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above the students' heads. "And I have always believed that language is a fortress. That you must learn every stone, every brick, every piece of mortar before you can truly enter. I was wrong." He paused, his eyes finally settling on Marcus. "Marcus has shown me that language is not a fortress you build, but a river that you find. It flows and you simply learn to navigate its currents." A ripple of low murmurs passed through the room. It was the closest thing to an apology they would ever get from Herr Schmidt, and it was a revelation. The class had always seen him as an unyielding pillar of academic rigor, a figure carved from the very rules he taught. To see him admit a flaw, a fundamental misjudgment, was to see a statue suddenly weep. Maria, the intellectual protégée, felt a sudden, profound shift in her own worldview. She had, like Herr Schmidt, believed in the fortress, in the meticulously constructed walls of perfect grammar and vocabulary. But hearing the effortless flow of Marcus's German had shaken her foundations. She looked at her notebook, at the neat, precise notes that suddenly seemed empty. She had been building a castle of dry facts, and he had been living in a waterfall. Chad, meanwhile, was simply confused. The teacher who had always terrified him had just become a person. A vulnerable, real person. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time he saw not a quiet oddball but something akin to a hero. A guy who had humbled the unhumbable. It was a new kind of cool, a kind that Chad, with all his athletic prowess, could never achieve. He felt an urge to talk to Marcus, to ask him how he did it, to hear the story behind the secret, but he didn't know how to approach him. The boy was still a mystery, just a slightly different, more magnetic one. Marcus, for his part, was deeply uncomfortable. The attention was a physical weight, an oppressive hum that followed him. He had always been defined by his invisibility, his ability to blend into the background. Now, his quietness was no longer a shield, it was a magnifying glass, drawing every eye. He had spent years cultivating a private world, and now it had been made public, exposed to the harsh glare of a fluorescent-lit classroom. He wanted to go back to being the ghost, but he knew that was impossible. Herr Schmidt finally looked away from Marcus and back at the class. "Today," he announced, "we will not be doing grammar drills. Today we will simply speak." He gestured vaguely toward the front of the room. "I want you to tell me about your weekends." In German, of course. Another shockwave passed through the room. This was a free-form assignment, a kind of conversational improvisation that was the exact opposite of Herr Schmidt's usual methodology. He was pushing them all out of the fortress and into the river, and they were all terrified of the current. Maria's hand shot up instinctively. "But Herr Schmidt, what about the cases? The prepositions?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. He simply smiled, a rare, almost beatific expression. "Don't worry about the cases, Maria. The river will find a way. Just speak." The exercise was, predictably, a disaster. Chad stumbled through a story about a football game, turning the past tense into a bizarre verbal pretzel. Maria, paralyzed by her own fear of making a mistake, could barely get a coherent sentence out. The class collectively floundered, their carefully constructed grammatical knowledge dissolving in the face of genuine, spontaneous conversation. As the period wore on, the frustration in the room was palpable. Students threw up their hands in defeat. Maria buried her face in her hands, muttering to herself about the proper use of the dative case. It was chaos, and Herr Schmidt, instead of getting angry, watched with a kind of sad serenity. He had broken them, and now he had to find a way to put them back together. He finally sighed and ran a hand through his gray hair. "It is difficult, is it not?" he said, his voice laced with understanding. "When you rely on the rules, you forget how to play the game." He walked over to Marcus's desk, a gesture of deference and a final, complete break from his old ways. "Marcus," he said, and the entire class held its breath. "I was a good professor yesterday. Today I feel like a student. I need your help." Marcus looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had been expecting a challenge, a test, a demand. Not an appeal for help. "I need you to help me show the class how the river flows," Schmidt said. "Not the rules but the feeling. The music. Can you do that?" Marcus hesitated for a long moment, a lifetime of guardedness fighting with a sudden, unexpected desire to share. He looked at Maria's defeated face, at Chad's curious, hopeful expression. He saw for the first time not a hostile audience, but a group of fellow travelers, lost and waiting for a guide. He nodded once. "Yes," he said, the single word hanging in the air. "I can." The classroom, once a place of forced quiet and academic pressure, had been transformed into a workshop. Schmidt, relinquishing his place at the head of the room, had pulled a chair to the side, becoming a spectator in his own class. He sat with his hands folded, watching with a mixture of awe and professional fascination as Marcus took center stage. The old textbook, the one filled with tedious verb tables and dry passages, lay discarded. The lesson was no longer confined to its pages. It was now a living, breathing thing. Marcus, despite his initial discomfort, seemed to find a strange sort of peace in this new role. He didn't stand at the front of the room. Instead, he stayed at his desk, speaking in a low, even tone that forced the others to lean in and listen closely. He wasn't teaching rules, he was sharing a feeling. He started with the basics, but not in the way Schmidt had. He didn't begin with a list of nouns and their genders. He began with a feeling. "Listen to the sound of the word," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "Der Baum." He repeated it, lengthening the vowel, emphasizing the hard B. "Der Baum." It's a strong, solid word. You can almost feel the tree, the rough bark, the strength in the trunk. He then contrasted it with another word. "Die Blume." It's a softer word. The B is gentler, though, and im flow. It's delicate like a flower. Maria, who had been studying German for years, felt a thrill of discovery. She had always memorized the gender of nouns as a random, arbitrary fact. Now she was hearing them as an auditory experience, a form of poetry. She scribbled in her notebook, but this time her notes were different. She was writing down not just the words but the sensations they evoked. She wrote, "Baum, strong, solid. Bloom, gentle, delicate." It was a new kind of learning, one that engaged her senses and her imagination, not just her memory. Chad, meanwhile, was completely captivated. He had never thought of language in this way. To him, words were just things you said to get what you wanted. But Marcus was showing him that words had texture, color, and emotion. Chad's football plays were forgotten, and for the first time he was listening with his entire being. He was learning to feel the language, not just memorize its rules. He felt a sudden, profound connection to the material. He wanted to understand more, to hear more. Marcus continued. He moved on to verbs, but instead of conjugating them on the board, he told stories. He spoke of the feeling of running, the breathless, forward momentum of the word laufen. He spoke of the gentle, repetitive motion of the word schwimmen, the way the syllables seemed to mirror the rhythmic strokes of a swimmer. He had a way of bringing the language to life, of making every word a tiny, encapsulated moment. He was a natural teacher, a born storyteller who just happened to be using German as his medium. The class ended much too quickly. The final bell rang, and for the first time, no one rushed to leave. They lingered, some of them approaching Marcus's desk with questions, others just standing quietly, absorbing the atmosphere. Chad was the first to speak to him. He was a little shy, a little awkward, but his sincerity was unmistakable. "Dude," he said, his voice low. "That was insane. How did you do that? How did you, feel the words?" Marcus looked up from his sketchbook, a small, genuine smile on his face. "You just listen," he said. "The language tells you what it is. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Chad nodded slowly as if he were trying to commit every word to memory. He was beginning to understand that there was a whole world beyond the rules of football, a world of nuance and feeling. Maria also approached Marcus, her expression a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Why didn't you tell us before?" she asked. Marcus shrugged. "There was nothing to tell," he said. "It was just something I did." He didn't mean to be dismissive, but to Maria, who had always been defined by her accomplishments, his simple statement was a revelation. He didn't need to be seen. He didn't need to be recognized. He had found joy in the doing, not the proving. She felt a sudden, deep sense of inadequacy, but it was quickly replaced by a profound curiosity. She wanted to know more. She wanted to learn from him. Herr Schmidt, watching from the side, felt an uncharacteristic sense of lightness. The burden of being the sole authority in the room had been lifted. He was no longer the keeper of the fortress. He was a fellow traveler, learning to navigate the river alongside his students. He had spent his life teaching the anatomy of language, but Marcus was teaching its soul. He had always believed he was the teacher, but he was now realizing that the greatest lesson he had ever learned had come from the quiet student in the back row. The classroom dynamic shifted from a rigid hierarchy to a collaborative organism, with Marcus as its unexpected heart. He didn't teach from a podium or a textbook. His lessons were fluid, conversational, and deeply personal. He would ask a question in German, something simple like, "Was ist dein Lieblingsfarbe?" "What is your favorite color?" And instead of waiting for a grammatically perfect answer, he would encourage them to feel the sounds. He'd tell them to whisper the word, to shout it, to say it with a question mark in their voice, with a period. He was teaching them that language wasn't just a collection of nouns and verbs, it was a form of self-expression. For Chad, this was a revelation. He had always been a kinetic learner, understanding the world through motion and action. The rigid, static rules of grammar had been an impenetrable wall. But Marcus's approach bypassed that wall entirely. One day Marcus asked the class to describe their favorite sport. Chad's hand shot up. He began to describe a football play, but he was struggling to find the words. He kept mixing up the past tense and the present tense. He got stuck, his face flushed with frustration. Marcus simply nodded. "Don't worry about the grammar," he said softly. "Just show me with the words. Show me the rhythm. The snap, the run, the tackle. What does the word for run, laufen, feel like?" Chad thought for a moment. He closed his eyes. Then he started again, but this time his words weren't just a list of vocabulary. He began to describe the play with a new, almost musical cadence. "Der Ball," he said, and the word felt like a snap. "Laufen," he breathed, and the word had a breathless, rushing quality. "Tackeln," he shouted, and the word was a hard, definitive thud. The grammar was still a little messy, but the feeling was undeniable. The play came alive. The class listened, captivated, no longer hearing just a story but experiencing it. Chad, for the first time in his life, felt a deep, profound connection to a foreign language. He had found its rhythm, and it was the same rhythm he had always known on the football field. Maria's journey, however, was far more difficult. She was a perfectionist, and Marcus's intuitive approach felt like a personal affront to everything she had ever learned. She still found herself correcting her classmates in her head, mentally ticking off their grammatical errors. She would go home and pore over her old textbooks, trying to find a rule, a logic, a reason for Marcus's methods. But there was none. His teaching was an art, not a science, and it drove her to a quiet, frantic frustration. One afternoon, Maria stayed behind after class. Herr Schmidt was at his desk and Marcus was quietly packing his bag. She approached them, her face a mask of polite desperation. "I don't understand," she said, her voice tight. "How can you learn without the rules? Without structure? I feel like I'm falling behind." Herr Schmidt looked at her with understanding. "Maria, you have a fortress of knowledge," he said. "The question is, what will you do with it?" Marcus, for the first time, looked up from his bag, his gaze direct and empathetic. "The rules are a map," he said. "They show you where things are. But the river is where you learn to swim." He picked up a sheet of paper from his desk, a loose sketch of a tree. It was not a realistic tree, but a series of interconnected, swirling lines that seemed to flow and pulse with energy. He then pointed to a single, small, perfectly drawn leaf in the center. "You're trying to draw every single leaf perfectly before you understand the whole tree," he said. "But the leaves only make sense when you feel the shape of the branches, the strength of the trunk, the way the whole thing breathes and moves." Maria stared at the sketch. It was not a drawing she would have made. She would have drawn a perfect, anatomically correct tree, a tree of facts and figures. Marcus's tree was a tree of feeling. For the first time, she saw that her mastery of the rules had blinded her to the very essence of the language. She felt a profound, almost painful shift. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was a river. Herr Schmidt, watching the exchange, felt a spark of an idea ignite. He had spent his life teaching the anatomy of language. Marcus was teaching its soul. He realized that the greatest lesson he could offer his students now was a bridge between the two. He had a task for them, a new project that would challenge them all, a project that would require both the precision of the fortress and the flow of the river. "Tomorrow," he announced to the room, his voice regaining some of its old authority, but with a new warmth, "we will begin our final project. It will be a group assignment. You will be writing a play. In German." A collective groan went up from the class. "A play? In German?" That was a different level of difficulty entirely. That was not just speaking, that was creating, collaborating, and performing. But Herr Schmidt just smiled, a small, knowing expression that hadn't been on his face in years. He looked from Maria to Chad and finally to Marcus. He knew that for this project to succeed, it would require the intellect of the perfectionist, the heart of the athlete, and the quiet genius of the artist. The fortress and the river would have to meet. And it was going to be beautiful. The initial groans about the play quickly morphed into a whirlwind of creative energy. Herr Schmidt had divided the class into small groups, a mix of the old social cliques and the new emergent friendships. Chad and Maria, the odd couple of the class, were in a group with Marcus and two other students who had largely gone unnoticed before. The initial meetings were tense, a clash of two very different worlds colliding over a single, collaborative task. Maria, as expected, came prepared with a meticulous plan. She had a list of characters, a detailed plot outline, and a perfectly constructed script, complete with rigid stage directions. She had approached the play as a mathematical equation, a problem to be solved with the right combination of plot points and grammatical structures. Her German was flawless, but her story was sterile, a stiff, uninspired narrative about a tourist visiting a German town. It was the fortress, perfectly built and completely uninhabited. Chad, on the other hand, had no plan, but he had an idea. He wanted to write about a football game. Not a simple game, but a dramatic, epic one, a battle of wills and strength and teamwork. He wanted to fill it with the kind of intense, raw emotion he felt on the field. He would describe the snap of the ball, the thud of the tackle, the breathless rush of a touchdown. His vocabulary was limited and his grammar was a mess, but his idea had a heart and a pulse. It was the river, wild and untamed. Marcus, as always, was the quiet center. He listened to both of them, his pencil moving slowly over his sketchbook, his mind a bridge between their two approaches. He saw Maria's need for structure and Chad's desire for emotion, and he understood that the play would fail if they didn't learn to combine both. He spoke to them privately, his words gentle but firm. To Maria he said, "Your script is perfect. It's a beautiful house. But a house without people is just a building. What if we put your rules to work for Chad's story? The rules can be a framework, not a prison." To Chad he said, "Your story is alive. It has so much energy. But a river without banks is just a flood. What if we used Maria's structure to guide it, to make sure everyone can follow the current?" He brought them together, and with Herr Schmidt watching from his desk, Marcus guided the first, difficult conversation. Maria, with great reluctance, began to let go of her perfect script. She started asking Chad questions about his story, not just about the grammar but about the feelings. "What does it feel like to be tackled?" she asked him. "What is the feeling of winning?" Chad, who had never been asked a question like that about his sport before, began to open up, describing the sweat, the adrenaline, the camaraderie. Maria listened intently, and for the first time she wasn't just hearing his words, she was feeling them. She began to find the German words to describe these emotions, to find the right verbs and adjectives that could capture the feeling of the game. Their collaboration was a kind of miracle. Maria's meticulous sense of structure gave Chad's story form and coherence. She was a master of the grammar, and she could see how to mold his passionate but clumsy German into something beautiful. She helped him find the right past tense for a verb, the right case for a noun, and she would explain it not with a rule, but with a metaphor that Marcus had taught her. "The dative case is like a hug," she would say to Chad. "It's the case for the person you're doing something for." Chad's visceral understanding of emotion gave Maria's technical perfection a soul. He pushed her to think not just about the correct word, but about the feeling behind the word. He challenged her to use language that was not just grammatically correct, but also alive and vibrant. They were no longer two separate people working on a project. They were a single entity, the fortress and the river, working together to create something they could not have done alone. The other students in the group, once silent observers, began to contribute. One of them, a girl named Sarah, was an artist who had never found her voice in the class. She began to sketch costumes and sets, bringing a visual dimension to the play. Another student, Leo, a musician, began to write a simple musical score for the transitions between scenes. The play was no longer just about German. It was about art and collaboration, and the beautiful, messy process of creating something new together. Herr Schmidt watched all of this with a quiet, profound sense of wonder. He had spent his career teaching students to be correct. Now he was watching them learn to be creative. He had taught them the language, but Marcus was teaching them how to be human with it. The fortress of his classroom was gone, replaced by a living, breathing river of conversation and collaboration, a current of ideas and emotions that was flowing in every direction. He knew that the play, whatever its final form, would be imperfect. It would have mistakes, but it would be alive. And that was more than he could have ever hoped for. The day of the performance arrived, and the usual high school German classroom felt like a theater on the eve of a sold-out show. Desks were pushed against the walls, chairs were arranged in rows facing the front, and the air was thick with a nervous, electric energy. The play, born from the unlikely union of Maria's meticulous structure and Chad's raw emotion, was finally ready. The two of them, along with the rest of their group, were backstage, which in this case meant huddled behind Herr Schmidt's large wooden desk, whispering last-minute lines and adjusting props. Maria was a different person entirely. The rigid, tightly wound perfectionist had given way to a passionate, empathetic director. She was no longer correcting grammar but was now talking about motivation, about the emotional arc of each character. "Chad," she whispered, her voice a mix of a command and a plea. "Remember the feeling of the snap. The tension, the energy. Let that carry you to the first line." She wasn't teaching him to speak German correctly, she was teaching him to feel it. And Chad, who had once seen her as an uptight intellectual rival, now looked at her with a profound, unshakable respect. He had found a new kind of teammate, one who understood the inner workings of his mind as well as she understood the rules of a dative case. Chad, for his part, was completely in his element. The lines of the play were no longer just words on a page. They were a script for a living, breathing moment. He had found a way to pour all of the emotion, all of the camaraderie, all of the raw, physical poetry of a football game into a language he had once loathed. His movements were fluid, his body language confident. He was no longer a student reciting lines. He was a quarterback in the middle of a game, and the field was this small, humble classroom. Marcus, as he had been throughout the entire process, was the quiet architect. He was not acting in the play, but he was everywhere. He had helped Sarah with the minimalist but evocative set design, a few simple sketches of a field and goalposts that managed to capture the essence of a stadium. He had worked with Leo on the sound cues, simple musical transitions that elevated the action and gave the play a sense of true drama. He sat in the very last row, a silent observer, a person who had found his purpose not in being the star, but in making others shine. He watched Maria and Chad and felt a deep, profound sense of pride. He had shown them the river, and they had not just learned to swim, they had learned to fly. Herr Schmidt sat in the front row, a solitary figure in the middle of the empty seats. He didn't have a grade book or a pen in his hand. He simply watched, his face a canvas of anticipation and a new kind of wonder. He was no longer the professor, he was the proudest spectator. He had always believed that the measure of a good teacher was the precision of their students' knowledge. Now he was seeing that the true measure was the courage of their expression. The lights went down, or rather the classroom lights were simply turned off, and Maria flipped on a small desk lamp to create a spotlight. The play began. The group of students, who had been so hesitant and clumsy at the beginning of the semester, now spoke with a confidence and a fluency that was breathtaking. The story of the football game unfolded in German, a narrative filled with tension and joy and defeat. There were still grammatical errors. Chad, in the heat of a particularly emotional monologue, would occasionally mix up a case or a verb tense. But no one noticed. The mistakes didn't matter. They were just small, insignificant pebbles in the powerful current of the river. The climax of the play was a single, long, dramatic scene. It was the final play of the game, a Hail Mary pass that would decide the fate of the team. Maria, narrating from the side, spoke with a breathless, rapid-fire urgency, describing the clock ticking down. Chad, as the quarterback, looked at his teammates, his German filled with a raw, desperate energy. He spoke of the fear, the hope, the need for a single, perfect throw. He said the word werfen, to throw, and the word itself was a visceral, physical act. The rest of the group, playing the other teammates, spoke of their trust and their determination. The scene was alive, electric, every word charged with a powerful, unspoken meaning. And then, with a final heart-stopping monologue from Chad, the play ended. The desk lamp went off, and the room was plunged into darkness and a profound, echoing silence. No one clapped. The applause was not for the performance. It was for the journey. It was for the transformation of Chad and Maria and the entire class. It was for the quiet boy in the back row who had shown them all that language wasn't just a fortress of rules, but a living, breathing thing that could be used to create art, to tell stories, to make a connection. The lights came on. The group stood there, slightly stunned by the silence, and looked out at the faces of their classmates. Tears were streaming down Maria's face, not of sadness but of pure, unadulterated triumph. Chad's chest was heaving, his face still flushed with the emotion of the moment. And in the very back row, Marcus sat with a small, satisfied smile on his face, the ghost of a person who had just shown them the power of a single perfect sound. The final bell of the semester rang, and the sound was both a relief and a lament. The students of Herr Schmidt's German class didn't rush out the door as they once did. They lingered, talking in small groups, their conversations now peppered with German words and phrases, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The classroom had become a home, a place of shared experience and transformation, and the thought of leaving it felt like a quiet sorrow. Herr Schmidt stood at his desk, watching them with a profound sense of gratitude. He had taught the rules of a fortress for 30 years, and in the last 2 months he had learned the heart of a river. He had witnessed a quiet boy unlock the potential of an entire class, not with instruction but with inspiration. He walked over to Marcus, who was, as always, sketching in his notebook. "Marcus," Herr Schmidt said, his voice quiet, "you have taught me more than I have ever taught you. Thank you." Marcus looked up, a rare, open smile on his face. "You taught me the map, Herr Schmidt," he said. "I just found a different way to use it." Herr Schmidt nodded, a deep, knowing look in his eyes. He had a gift for Marcus, something that had been in his family for generations. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was an old, well-worn volume of Rilke's poetry, a first edition that had belonged to his grandfather. He handed it to Marcus. "The rules of grammar are a map," he said. "But poetry is a language that speaks to the soul. I think you understand that better than anyone I know. Take it. The river will find its way to the sea." Marcus took the book, his fingers tracing the old, gold-embossed letters on the cover. He looked at Herr Schmidt, and in that moment, there was a quiet, unspoken understanding between the old professor and the young student, two souls who had found a common language in a small classroom in a high school in America. As Marcus walked out of the classroom for the last time, Maria and Chad fell into step beside him. They were no longer defined by their grades or their social standing. They were a team, a friendship forged in the crucible of a play. "Hey man," Chad said, punching him lightly on the shoulder. "That was the coolest thing I've ever done. And it was all because of you." Maria nodded. "He's right, Marcus," she said, her voice soft. You showed me that it's okay not to be perfect. That you have to make mistakes to really learn." Marcus just smiled. He looked at them, at the football player who had found the rhythm of a foreign language and the perfectionist who had learned to embrace imperfection, and he felt a deep, warm sense of peace. He had spent his life being a ghost, a silent observer, a person who lived in his own private world. But in showing them the river, he had finally found his own voice, and he had learned that the most beautiful language of all was the one that you use to connect with other people. As the three of them walked out of the school and into the bright sunlight of a new summer, they carried with them not just the knowledge of a foreign language, but a deeper understanding of themselves, of each other, and of the profound, transformative power of a single, perfect moment. They had started in a fortress, each of them locked in their own private tower, but they had ended in the open air, a river of shared experience flowing out into the wide, waiting world. And for the first time in his life, Marcus felt not just like he was watching the world, but like he was a part of it, a single, perfect note in a beautiful, unfinished song. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.